I know I was raped. You weren't nothing but a bunch of scum.
Therefore, these proceedings are now
Putting
concluded.
somebody who was raped to death.
On a dark Florida highway in 1989, a woman stood beside the road waiting for the next car to stop. To passing drivers, she looked like just another hitchhiker. But over the next year, the men who stopped for her would disappear one by one. And when the truth finally surfaced, the world would meet one of the most controversial killers in American history. The story of Aileen Wuornos is not just about murder. It is a story filled with abuse, survival, anger, and a darkness that slowly consumed a life long before the crimes began. To understand what happened on those highways in Florida, we have to start many years earlier. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her life began with chaos. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted child molester and psychopath who would later die in prison. He never met Aileen. Her mother abandoned the family when Aileen was still an infant, leaving her and her brother to be raised by their grandparents. But the home they grew up in was far from safe. Accounts from neighbors and later investigations revealed that Aileen experienced severe abuse during childhood. She was beaten frequently. She grew up surrounded by violence, neglect, and emotional trauma. By the age of 11, Aileen was already showing signs of a troubled life. She began trading sexual acts for cigarettes and small amounts of money. At just 14 years old, she became pregnant after being assaulted by a friend of her grandfather. The baby was given up for adoption. Shortly after that, her grandparents threw her out of the house. Now homeless and alone, Aileen began living in the woods near her old neighborhood, surviving however she could. These early years shaped the person she would become. Her life became a constant cycle of instability. She drifted across the country, often hitchhiking, stealing, and engaging in prostitution just to survive. She had several arrests during this period, including charges for robbery, disorderly conduct, and weapons possession. In 1976, she married a wealthy 69-year-old yacht club president named Louis Gratz Fell, but the marriage quickly collapsed. Within weeks, Aileen's violent temper led to multiple public incidents. She assaulted Fell with his own cane during one argument, and the marriage ended less than a year later. From that point forward, her life spiraled deeper into crime and poverty. She continued drifting from place to place until eventually ending up in Florida during the 1980s. And it was there that she met the one person who would stay by her side through everything. Her name was Tyria Moore. The two women met at a bar in Daytona Beach in 1986. They quickly formed a relationship, and by many accounts, this was one of the few times Aileen seemed genuinely happy. But the relationship had a serious problem. Neither woman had stable income. To support both of them, Aileen returned to prostitution, often working along Florida highways where truck drivers and travelers pass late at night. For a while, this seemed to be how they survived, until November 30th, 1989. That night, 51-year-old electronics store owner Richard Mallory picked up Aileen along Interstate 75. Days later, his abandoned car was found in a remote area. Inside the vehicle were signs of violence. Mallory's body was discovered weeks later in the woods. He had been shot multiple times. At the time, investigators did not yet realize what they were dealing with. But over the next year, more bodies would appear across Florida highways. Each victim had something in common. They were middle-aged men who had been traveling alone, they had picked up a hitchhiker, and they had been shot. In 1990 alone, 6 men were murdered. Their names were David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Symes, Troy Burris, Charles Humphreys, Walter Antonio. Each crime scene followed a similar pattern. The victims were found in wooded areas or along rural roads. Most had been shot several times, but something unusual began to appear in the investigation. Witnesses reported seeing a woman driving the victims' cars after the murders. Police began searching for a female suspect. At the time, female serial killers were extremely rare, and investigators initially struggled to believe a woman could be responsible for such a violent string of murders. but the evidence kept pointing in that direction. The breakthrough came in January 1991. Police discovered that stolen items from some of the victims had been pawned in Florida. The pawn slips were signed by one name, Aileen Wuornos. Once investigators ran her criminal record and photograph, the case quickly escalated. Police also discovered Tyria Moore. Believing Moore might be in danger or involved, they brought her in for questioning. Under pressure from investigators, Moore eventually agreed to help them. She placed a series of recorded phone calls to Aileen while police listened. During those calls, Moore begged Aileen to confess, and eventually, Aileen did. She admitted to the murders, but she insisted on something important. She claimed every killing was done in self-defense. According to Wuornos, the men she shot had attempted to assault or rape her while she was working as a prostitute. She said she killed them because she feared for her life. This claim would become one of the most controversial parts of the case. Some investigators believed parts of her story. It was later revealed that the first victim, Richard Mallory, had previously served time in prison for violent sexual offenses, but prosecutors argued that the killings were not acts of self-defense. They pointed to the fact that Wuornos had robbed many of the victims afterward, taking their money, cars, and belongings. To them, the motive was simple. The trial began in 1992. The courtroom quickly became the center of intense media attention. Reporters were fascinated by the case. A female serial killer who claimed to be defending herself from violent men. Public opinion became divided. Some people saw Wuornos as a cold-blooded murderer. Others believed she was a victim of lifelong abuse who had finally snapped. During the trial, Wuornos often appeared unstable. She shouted at lawyers, interrupted proceedings, and sometimes spoke angrily to the media. The jury ultimately found her guilty of murder. She was sentenced to death.
I have made peace with my Lord, and I have asked forgiveness. I am sorry that my acts of self-defense ended up in court like this, but I take full responsibility for my actions. It was them or me. I am sorry for all the pain that my actions have caused. I am prepared to die if you say it is necessary.
I sentence you in case number 91-463 to death for the murder of Troy Burris. Case number 91-304, I sentence you to death for the murder of Charles Humphreys. Case number 91-112, Citrus County case number, I sentence you to death for the murder of David Spears.
Thank you. And probably see, I'll be up in heaven while y'all are rotting in hell.
We will handle
I
that.
hope you
If
get
not,
raped in the one of
the
these days.
Fifth Circuit to handle that.
Okay, there will be an automatic appeal. You have the right to an appeal. Mr. Glazer, is that going to be handled by you
May
or the
your
public
wife and
defender?
kids get raped.
I would ask that you would
Right
appoint
in
the
the
public office.
Okay, I'll appoint the public defender's office to handle the appeal. There's one other thing that I want to say that I think needs to be said.
I know I was raped. You weren't nothing but a bunch of scum.
Therefore, these proceedings are now
Putting
completed.
somebody who was raped to death.
Over the next several years, Wuornos continued to give interviews from prison. Her behavior became increasingly unpredictable. At times, she insisted she had acted in self-defense. Other times, she made shocking claims that there was a conspiracy against her. She accused prison officials of poisoning her food. She said unseen forces were controlling events around her. By the early 2000s, Wuornos made a surprising decision. She asked the courts to stop all appeals. She said she wanted the execution to proceed. In interviews, she told reporters that she was tired and ready to die. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Her final statement was brief but strange. She said she would return one day like Independence Day with Jesus. And with that, one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history came to an end. But even today, the story of Aileen Wuornos continues to spark debate. Was she a calculated serial killer? Or was she a deeply damaged woman shaped by years of abuse and violence? Some psychologists believe her childhood trauma played a major role in her behavior. Others argue that many people experience trauma without becoming killers. The truth may lie somewhere in between. What is certain is that the highways of Florida during 1989 and 1990 became a stage for a dark and tragic story. A story about survival, violence, and the blurred line between victim and predator. and decades later, the name Aileen Wuornos still remains one of the most haunting figures in the history of true crime.